So I have to say, for starters, that this is the first panel I've ever moderated where we have royalty and nobility. And you can be gentry.
Yeah.
I'll be the serf, so no, I'm joking. It is lovely having you all here. Thank you so much for joining us. I think there are a lot of topics that have come up over the last day and a half that will kind of weave naturally into this conversation, but this is really specifically on the startup ecosystem throughout Europe. And I'd love to just hear, for starters, very briefly from each of you, where you see the current strengths and weaknesses. We see a lot of several hubs where there's a lot of creativity and innovation and talent, really deep talent, great seed funding, and yet the large tech, at least internet companies, the top 10 internet companies by market cap are US and China. So I'd love to hear about just what's going on and how you assess the current startup ecosystem here. Can we start with you, Constantijn?
Yeah, well, I think that was a good analysis. The big tech companies of the last big tech evolution are from the US, and then the next generation is maybe Chinese. And in Europe, we have basically missed that boat. I think we were all too happy with our GSM standard, and we were thinking that we were leading the world, and then we forgot about the internet, and then we missed cloud, and we missed mobile, and then suddenly we were in a completely different age where we have AI and quantum is dawning. So the good thing is that we're now all aware of this, so that's one thing. I think the bad thing is that we are in a political momentum where our politicians are talking about decoupling our economies, where we are fearing towards being defensive isolationist, whereas I think Europe's strength would be in staying really connected in the global economy. Obviously, we shouldn't be naive. We should be aware of some of the critical technologies and assets that we want to protect. But on the whole, our kind of startups and tech companies really benefit from being well connected. And I think there's a lot of positive developments. If you look at the total volume of venture capital in Europe, it's growing substantially. Some of the deals are yielding better returns than the ones in the US. So I think a lot is happening, but we are a few years behind, and we are behind in the kind of ambition that our entrepreneurs have, and the kind of risk appetite that our investors have in growing those companies. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a positive momentum among the entrepreneurs, but the total climate in Europe and maybe even globally is maybe a bit less favorable.
Young, you invest all over on multiple continents. What do you see on this one?
Well, I think that first, Europe always had been a great foundation for technologies. Without Europe, there wouldn't be no internet. Without Europe, there would be no mobile communication. So fundamentally, the technology has been here, the talents had been here. But I think harnessing that into startup and then moving that into scale up had been a challenge. Mm-hmm. But actually, last 7 years, we invested over 40 companies in Europe, all over from AI all the way to changing the insurance model to improving health. So we see a lot of disruptive ideas that are coming. I think the challenge here had been more to do with how do you get that great research ideas and then making it successful startup, which there are many, but then how do you make it scale up? Because a lot of jobs are not in startup. Actually, jobs are in scale-ups. The jobs that have 100 people to 10,000 people, right? In that range. So I think that has been a challenge. But there are a number of unicorns that are coming out in Europe now. Last year alone, I believe there was 18 more. So unicorns means there are a lot of money to spend. I don't know, I guess unicorn used to be a very rare species, but you get to see a lot more unicorns running around. So maybe it's a sign of overvaluation. But the point, I think, is more money, there's more opportunities. With that, I think there are more companies that can stay longer and therefore attract more money, which in turn is a vicious cycle of a flywheel, which will create more jobs, I believe, long term.
And Katie?
I'm very positive, actually, and you may be surprised because we discussed before, and I always drew a rather gloomy picture of Europe. And I'm with Constantijn. Yes, we've been extremely complacent. We've been pampering our Silicon Valley at the time when others were actually somehow building their Silicon Valley and other things. It took us a while. to understand where the opportunities are. And I think they're clearly given. It needed a few wake-up calls, and some of them we didn't choose by ourselves. One, of course, is the friction we are facing right now across the Atlantic. It's something where we cannot count on any longer doing homework for us, with which we would then link up and say, okay, this is something where we can just take whatever's been produced over there. We are one Western world that will just function. This time is over. It might be an interesting factor that now more and more American investments come into Europe, and so do Chinese investments as well, and that's the second factor. China coming from the other side and giving us the other wake-up element here. They're coming as investors, but they're also coming, embracing us when it's somehow tied to their idea of one belt, one road. Italy is eagerly following them in that regard. And it's not only about some of the classical elements, it's a lot about tech and getting involved in the startup community as well. And then some do understand and start to understand, well, there's something in Europe which is an absolute powerhouse and something we have built over decades, and that's, I'd say, what we would probably call the traditional industry, but it's connected to manufacturing, it's connected to certain elements of engineering and elements of automation, all the way to robotics. Tie that to artificial intelligence, tie that to the blockchain industry, tie that to everything that's happening around the globe right now, and you have something that develops, I think, extremely promising and very properly right now. So that's a starting point. And yes, we have heard yesterday my old friend Bruno Le Maire, who was a little bit insulted by Alan Murray's hint that that Elon Musk, in one of his rare moments when he wasn't stoned, actually decided to bring Tesla to Berlin. And the first reaction, of course, we could have offered a lot of good products for him in the Netherlands. But first reaction was, typical European reaction was, why Berlin? And of course, the Netherlands would have loved to have it. Paris would have loved to have it. And the German first reaction was, oh, we don't need that kind of plastic matchbox. We do the better cars. But it's the best thing that could happen to Germany, to the industry, and actually to Europe. But forming out of that, we need a European strategy, not only a German, a French, or a Dutch strategy.
So give an example. I mean, how can that be replicated in that kind of marriage of what you're saying is the kind of successful traditional manufacturing past and other industries with newer technology innovations and investments?
But take the whole, so here speaks the German, of course, but take the automotive industry and take everything that has been developed so far ahead of what we've been thinking of, and we've been sleepwalking for many, many years in respect of electrification and in effect of automated elements in the car industry. On the other hand, you still have an industry there that stands for an enormous amount of quality. And here, I'd like to take that example again of a Tesla. Tesla has a great Google element in there. It has all preconditions at one point to go into self-driving. It has the E character, but the quality of the car is so-so, and that's the mildest phrase I can find for it. So it's one example, but you can adapt it to many other things. You can adapt blockchain industry to a lot of traditional industries we have in Europe. You could go into the whole healthcare sector, which is still functioning pretty well as opposed to what we see, for instance, in the US, to artificial intelligence and machine learning aspects. So those are chances for Europe, chances where we could move ahead, but again, we shouldn't do it in our typical, fragmented, very selfish, inward-looking way in Europe. We should see us as a market of 550 million people, and we should strive for a European single digital market and European answers. Otherwise, we won't be capable of actually winning that game.
So, Constantijn, unfortunately, legal marijuana is no longer a selling point for a company coming from California. We have that there now too. So what are you doing to talk about a bit about the program TechLeap and what you're doing in order to not only to promote, of course, entrepreneurs who are already on the ground and are there, but to promote more investment to come in?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of, also now in Europe, a lot of large public funds, which I think may help some way, but they don't replace the market actually. So I think what government shouldn't be doing is set up big kind of public venture funds and then invest directly in companies. I mean, if you want to do anything, then try to get the European venture industry to accelerate by co-investing or attracting the top-tier funds from the rest of the world to come and invest here. So you can do that by co-investment strategies like they've done in Israel in the past and they've done in other places. I think that's an important way, because venture capital in the end will be much better place to choose which technology, which businesses are going to be successful, and they have a lot of experience as well how you scale things. And it's exactly the issue that Mr. Young actually mentioned is the scaling is a problem, and the scaling is as much an issue in culture and but also market size. For instance, if you're in the Netherlands, you're a small market, but it's just big enough to actually make quite a decent business. It's not like in Israel where you really have to, where the culture is you have to go out there, and people tend to want to build their company in the Netherlands and then start looking, after a few years, how can I go abroad? And we see that what is a real differentiator is when an American venture capital firm comes in and sees the model is right, the technology is right, but your thinking is small. And taking that and applying some of their scaling experiences, also their sales experience and their networks to these companies. So one of the really critical things is how to get more venture capital from the outside coming in, as we're also building our own venture pool. And another point which you also mentioned is tech transfer. I think we're not going to build the next Google and these things, but we are seeing that these technologies can be applied to every sector, and we are experiencing some massive global trends and transitions, like the energy transition, and those offer great opportunities. So we have the technologies to deal with some of these issues. We have massive, innovations in food technologies, which we deal with food shortage and population growth. But it's how to get that into the market in a way that it scales. That is the challenge. So we're working on that too.
Okay. Anything that you found that works so far, especially when it comes to bringing in outside investment from the venture capital community?
Well, what used to work was that you basically put €1 down, €1 investment, and you put 5 public euros in. I mean, that will work. I mean, it works in Singapore. But now many of the venture capital firms have so much capital to spend that capital really doesn't do it for them anymore. But we are talking with for instance, our pension funds and institutional investors in the Netherlands, which have, I think, 1.6 trillion euro under management, but they don't spend any of that or hardly any of that on venture capital. So if we just get a little rounding error of their investments going to venture capital, will already be an incredible boost.
Yeah. Young, what are you seeing? You invest in a lot of different regions. What do you see today from European startups? And maybe you can't make such a generalization, but if you can, or go country by country, that's differentiated.
Well, so there are, I think, some of the issues that we talked about earlier for creating a large scale-up is the mindset. A mindset of entrepreneurs thinking, am I starting a company for local market, whether it's France or Germany, or are you thinking about European market, or are you thinking about global market? So I think that mindset is really critical. And dependent mindset, you are going to get different investors, and the combination of an entrepreneur and the mindset of venture capitalists that can combine to optimize that, I think is where connecting points is. So that, I think, is an opportunity for local Europeans. But when I look at the companies around geography, we're looking at companies that can really address, I call 4 C's. And one of the C is really about consumer experience. And it's all about you. Everything is getting personalized. Everything is about information around personal medicine, personal insurance, from just genetic demographic-driven solutions, which means based on data and AI. And then all the information is now shared through cloud. So the infrastructure that enables the cloud to connect So these type of things are going much faster than the way it used to be, and therefore the company can scale up much easier than traditional companies that are building, location by location. And then we also look at companies that are really also addressing security and cyber-related areas, because I think fundamentally, as you're going very personal, we have so much information about you, and if your information is in cloud, who owns the data? So I think that's a fundamental question that have to be addressed. We believe it should be owned by you. And then question is, how do you protect that? And so there's a lot of technologies and companies that are going to evolve around this, from industrial to personal, even government, right? So that's all the, I think, elements that we really have to think through. And then lastly, I think there is a lot of geo conflicts, I call, and we talked about Atlantic, we talked about the other side of Asia. We're a small country where we are from, so we kind of sandwiched in between, try to navigate that. And it's creating an enormous pressure to figure out how to invest, how to partner, and how to be a valuable partner in the ecosystem, because it's getting more complicated than ever. Even investing, if you have a certain money, you might have to worry about certain way of investing because of the conflict that are coming up.
I want to hear your perspectives on that too. I mean, do you feel like you're stuck in the middle in some ways?
Well, I think
when it comes to the geopolitical situation.
The geopolitical situation is, yes, certainly we are running the risk right now of being squeezed between these two global forces. But we'll only be squeezed if we don't understand ourselves as a potential global force as well. And I come back to the point I made at the beginning here. It's if we are stuck in our obsessive behavior to renationalize in Europe, then we'll never get to that stage. But if we see ourselves as something which could be created despite or maybe because of Brexit as well, and I stop here, won't mention Brexit afterwards again, but it again offers that tiny chance right now. We are the threshold at the moment. We are the crossroads. And the others won't wait for us, and they are watching our weaknesses quite sophisticatedly. And if I hear then the finance minister yesterday talking about, well, we first have to look at France, but this is all about a European idea, I'd like to hear him say, well, let's talk about Europe first, and then let's see how our nations fit into that. Of course, it has a lot to do that some of the attempts of framing Europe as a strong player in that regard have not resonated very well. And it's the only one sitting here in Paris right now who actually came up with a larger European idea was the current president, Emmanuel Macron, at his Sorbonne speech 2 years ago. And the only thing he gained from that, specifically from Berlin, where he was waiting for an answer to shape something out of that, was what? Thundering silence, nothing else. So, of course, it's a little frustrating to watch that right now, but if we see these geopolitical movements, that's something that could happen. Could I just follow up on one point, because I think that's important also to understand why we are very often struggling with not coming into that kind of growth development of interesting tech companies as we see them in the US and in China has a lot to do with our mentality, and it might also be somehow connected specifically to a German obsession to be extremely risk averse. And that kind of aversion, of course, has a lot to do with not being blamed for a failure. And it's not a coincidence that, for instance, the term Schadenfreude does not have a translation in English. It's a German term, and it very much copes with where we are with our mindset. So, in the US, of course, growth stage is extremely pampered, and in Europe and in Germany, very often you have to be substantial, profitable already at that point. Is that a bad sign? Not necessarily, but we don't push it far enough.
Is the Berlin airport a good analogy for what's... No, I'm just joking.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. I was just... And you could also mention Volkswagen.
I just wanted to bring it up somehow during this panel. No, I'm joking. But can you... anything to add on that note, on the
being
geopolitical?
Squeezed, I think, well, I completely second that we can allow ourselves to be squeezed. And I'm quite sure that the way things are going between the US and China, that the US will want to squeeze Europe and want to force Europe to join the American camp in decoupling the economy. And I think, and even even if the next president is a Democrat, I don't even know if much will change there. And I think that it is more likely to happen if Europe doesn't have its own positive strategy, because the negative and strategies are the easy ones, but to have a positive strategy about where you want to be with Europe, what you want to contribute to the world, where, how do we think we're going to walk the tightrope between retaining our welfare states and societies on one hand, and still be highly innovative and relevant at a global stage, and also being able to actually use that economic power in a political sense, which Europe has been very bad at. If we don't do that, then the chances are much higher that we do get squashed. But I do think that so many of these big societal trends actually offer opportunities to entrepreneurs everywhere. And that if Europe and if the governments in Europe would play it well and create, and not, for instance, what's happening now is that in terms of genomics, in terms of data, I won't mention it, we don't go into data too much, but in terms of medical equipment and all these things, we are creating regulatory environments that are so restrictive that it's very difficult for entrepreneurs to actually develop. So actually those are things we can do. We can actually support by regulations or setting standards an acceleration of electrification of mobility. We could do all that. That's the stuff that government can do well. What government doesn't do very well is invest and create a lot of through subsidies, hope that we can actually overcome basically the gap between Silicon Valley and Europe. So I really hope that if governments are smart with a vision about where these transitions are going, supporting innovation in those transitions, and having the kind of the regulatory environment that balances out innovation on the one hand and giving security and stability to people on the other.
Can I add a thought to that? It is quite telling that it is almost unknown in Europe that we have that Horizon program, which is which is an investment program coming from the European Union. It's now lifted to another $100 billion to the year up until the year 2027. So those are things that are not communicated well enough. They would be linked. They could be linked also to national initiatives. They could be linked to other things. And they're very often tied to certain restrictions, and I take your point entirely. I'm with you. This is we all too often create regulation that is hamstringing everyone. On the other hand, we have also created one interesting export success, and that's and you may crucify me for that, but it's GDPR. And GDPR, of course, is nothing where everybody's absolutely happy about. But on the other hand, it was a missing link in many regards, also in respect of things that were going utterly wrong in other parts of this world. So that kind of self-confidence we can actually allow ourselves and build on such things too.
So,
I would disagree a bit with that, because I think that norm setting is good, and I think Europe has been quite at the forefront of norm setting in tech, but I was very much involved in GDPR, and it started in about 2011. It means that you have a 6-year window in which this discussion is happening. And so the whole AI discussion wasn't there. So the GDPR was developed without any view or vision on AI. So what I think we should be doing in this world of tech, and if we want to, as Europe, retain our kind of global leadership in norm setting, if we think we can, then we should have mechanisms that allow much more flexible regulation. So with sunset clauses or review clauses that for instance, now the GDPR, now we know how it works, and now we know that the world is changing, that there is an easier way to make adjustments to that, to the regulatory frameworks. But that usually takes, it takes 5 years or 6 years. So if we now discover that Europe is lagging in AI because we don't have access to data, and there are certain ways that the GDPR was constructed that actually do not work very well, or we cannot enforce it or something, there's just no lever you can pull to adjust that set of legislation. So I think so I agree to a certain degree, but I think we shouldn't kind of pat ourselves on the back too soon for GDPR.
Okay, I have more questions on that, but do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about government. We talk a lot about regulation. But at the end of the day, we're talking about Silicon Valley of Europe, right? What does that mean? It's all about success brings success. Great entrepreneurs attract more entrepreneurs. Great entrepreneurs attract venture capitalists. Great entrepreneurs also create push and pull for these topics of government and others. So I think it's all a question of chicken and egg, but at the end of the day, I think individuals taking risk, building business, and being able to create something that are big will attract more opportunities. And I've seen this happening in places like Israel over the years. And I think also you see that, of course, in Silicon Valley. I think there's a tremendous opportunities in Europe to do that because there's so much talent. Yeah. There's so much talent and so much opportunities to do it. I think maybe it's a risk appetite. It's also just being able to see there are successful entrepreneurs next to you, and they want to imitate the success. I think that would be the biggest drive for, I think, successful outcomes for many smart people out here.
And this is the thing, it's quite easy, you know. London was not in a good place in the 90s, you know. Through few policy interventions, they've now become by far the ecosystem in Europe that's leading. It's leading with all global ecosystem. If you look at Amsterdam, what we've done in the last 4.5 years, you know, it's not so difficult. Look what Estonia is doing. You know, a country comes out of communism, and in a short time they have kind of been front runners in crypto and in other things. So it actually is possible. And if you look at, and I'm not that gloomy about Europe, if at least our politicians would also kind of have a more proactive and positive view, because if you look at all the benchmarks, you know, it's always the Nordics and the Netherlands and Switzerland and often the UK that are right up there, and often Germany when it comes to innovation, when it comes to connectivity, when it comes to well-being, you know, all these things. So the macro indicators are actually really good. So there's no reason why we would not actually be much more proud and much more assertive about what we can do, if only we would support entrepreneurship and get the kind of also the capital available to support those companies.
Right, the entrepreneurship thing is the one factor which I think has to change fundamentally in mindset here and come a little bit closer to what we could learn from the other side of the Atlantic here. The other one is also we need to find ways and means to keep our talent here. So we do have a higher number of developers in Europe than we have in the US. But when it comes to the moment that they make their career into interesting positions, it's just one example. It's stock options are extremely taxed in Germany. So with that, why would you choose a German startup that promises you, well, you get a little bit of the company, you lose it right away. You go to the other side.
Is that an issue also with the entrepreneurs, that they don't want to give away equity to their staff, or is it just a fiscal issue in Germany?
I think it's a good combination of both, and the one feeds into the other.
Yeah. You can give
if you dare as a politician to change that, you might have a counterwave. That's certainly true.
That we can change in Europe.
Yeah.
Shall we?
I don't feel like I'm even needed here. You guys are doing such an awesome. No, but any questions from you guys? We do need you. Anybody, or we can keep. I had a feeling. You've been smiling.
Okay, Gary.
I think he wants you to diss GDPR.
It's a great panel with some of my closest friends. GDPR is viewed as a positive example, and maybe for big tech companies and other companies, it's not a problem. But it is a barrier to entry for smaller companies. And Europe's strategy towards bigger companies seems to be, let's penalize the biggest companies in the world that aren't European. And I know there's an argument against that, and maybe they should be, I don't know. But the point is, if you want small companies, what has to change in Europe? Is it the labor laws? Is it things like GDPR, now soon artificial intelligence being regulated? Is it friendly? What has to change?
Well, the bureaucratic embrace you get. That's my euphemistic term for it. You get, especially in my home country, is still extremely tight. So to leave them room to maneuver, to let them a certain element of let's say failure allowance to a certain extent without being stigmatized after that is absolutely important. So it's a mindset issue, but then also, of course, it is an issue whether you have to comply to any idiocy that's being produced in the capitals. Again, I wouldn't call GDPR an idiocy. It's outdated already the moment it's been produced, but that's hello, welcome to politics. This is how we work. and we'll always be late in that very respect. But it has brought up one thing which I think will be of growing importance, regardless whether we are a small company or a larger company. Especially if you deal with data in any respect. The privacy issue will, I think, be of growing importance regardless where we look at in the world. And that's something where at least a few people thought about, can we find a solution here? Is the solution perfect? Definitely not. Is it one with which a young company, a startup, has to deal right away somehow as well? Yes, probably, because all too often, and that's what I see very often happening in the US, you're being thrown into a growth stage without even having to think about profit or all the other things. At one point you might fail, you might be thrown against the wall, but specifically at the moment when you go international, you're lacking three things. You're lacking cross-cultural knowledge, point one. You're lacking any idea of the geopolitical impact your technology might have. And thirdly, you have no idea about regulatory aspects. The earlier you start also thinking about these issues, the better you'll be prepared also for going international. And that's something I think where a European company could have an advantage in that very respect.
Unfortunately, we do need to wrap. I'm so sorry to cut things off just as we were getting heated up. But thank you guys so much for being here. We could go on forever.